The birth of Lawrence Town was basically because it was a good calling off place for trade, and it was quite large at the time and had good access to the river by carts, the farmers, and of course family events. And Lawrence itself, as many people are aware, it became a major port on the river for dropping off people, goods, cattle. I mean, the whole river was just a transit area for every piece of humanity and its needs. You came down with the family, everyone met and had a social. So it wasn't just a ferry or a service line, it was a lifeline, I think. The original tender for the first punt was in the 1880s, and there was two actual ferries, one at Sportsman's Creek and one at Bluff Point. The name Elbow appears early in the map and it describes the section of river around Sportsman's Creek. It also had a secondary name called Devil's Elbow. And I guess this is named because of the riverboat captains were finding this section of the river up to Lawrence from the Grafton district very difficult to navigate because the narrowing through the mud flaps, and especially during times of low tide or flooding, which changed the direction of the channels.
It was always known as the deepest, the narrowest, the widest and the shallowest, all within a kilometre.
In the 1940s, up until even 50, it was still only 4-car ferry. And from those days on, it's just got bigger and bigger and bigger to what they've got today.
Back in 1971-72, they were all squealing for a bigger ferry. So they bought a 6-car ferry up and put on there, and it's still no better because you still had the influxes of traffic increasing and increasing. Then after I left it in 72, they bought a 9-car ferry and put there. Then that wasn't good enough, so they bought a 12-car ferry. The ferry what they got there now, they cut it in halves and put a section in the middle of it.
It was about 1944 when we were at the Lawrence Ferry when Dad drove the punt. The war was on. It was a 4-car ferry, and if it broke down, we had to wind it across those days. Wasn't much traffic. We used to do more fishing than driving the ferry, but traffic was there where we had to operate her on time. There was no meal allowance those days, meal times. We had to work. If a vehicle come, well, Dad used to have to go and get that vehicle and leave his lunch. We remember when the butchers used to come in the horse and cart those days. Dad would row the punt, leave the punt on this side of the river, and he'd come at 4 o'clock in the morning and he'd bring the punt back across so Dad wouldn't have to get out of bed. If something did happen, well, he had to pull the boat across to get the punt and bring it back.
Well, when we were on the ferry, I was only young, and the boat kept coming up the river, blowing the blast and the horn all the time. And I said to my mum and Dad, I said, what's he doing that for? Well, they said, the war is over.
Remember when the circuses used to come to town, they had a big round tank for the radiator, and the elephant, he stuck his trunk in the thing, and it was hot, and he let out the biggest squirrel, and he squirted water down the side. He gave her a suck of her, you know, and he blew her away.
Yeah, the rough weather was there, and the old rope would get rusty. The ferry would break the rope with the cars on, and she'd float away up the river or down the river. Did that 3 times in our time.
Depending on the tide.
Depending on the tide. It only had 1 rope then, where now they got 2. Mum and Dad were on the other side on the ferry to get traffic, and a big storm come, and it blew the Lawrence Tower down, and it just reached the river. That's how far away it was, although it's 500 and something feet high. After a fresh oil, you got plenty of rain, and it brought the water down from up the top of the river. The flaps used to go down with the weight of the ferries into the water, and you'd hop all these mullet and get up on the flaps, and we used to stand out there waiting for the fish to jump on the flaps to get them before they got back in.
It was nothing for 3 blokes to go in out in the fishing on a Saturday or Sunday morning and catch 300 flathead in a boat by hand line. That's
Give them
how
all
thick
away.
these. They'd give them all, walk around, give them to people.
Well, it's so thick though.
They couldn't eat them, so they'd just give them to people in those days. And it was
You keep talking like this to young fellas, and they keep winding you up, you know, making out it's old stories that wasn't right, but it was true.
That's how we lived those days, with the farmers like the Egginses, the Comerfords, Bernards. We used to share things, but today people, they'd rather let them rot on the field than give them away, you know. All the groceries and that used to come in by boats those days. The potatoes and that, used to go out. They used to load all them on. They used to take them away, and then they started taking them on trucks and used to take them to Grafton then and send them by rail. But they all used to go on boats before that, in the 40s, up to the 50s, even to the 50, even 50 I can remember it.
Oh, well, the big timber boats used to come into the Clarence and they'd go up to Grafton, up to the timber mills and load timber and come back. There one time one was coming back and it hit the beacon near the Lawrence there, and they had to wait till high tide and get another boat to pull it off. And every time they come up and down the river, they'd blast the horn to let the ferrymaster know that they were coming. You had to give weight on.
Always boats on the river. It was always pretty busy. Not as busy today.
Jock Williams put his timber truck in on the Lawrence side, load of logs on. Alan Smith was driving a truck for Kelsall's. He put it in with a load of sawn timber on the Lawrence side. Then after a while, the Maclean Shire decided to bring their low loader and dozer across from Maclean, and then they rolled it over on its side, sunk the ferry and everything. And with the ferry, you used to put cattle across on the hoof. And the biggest day I had there was 373 header. There was no trucks them days that truck them.
And in those days, as Philip said about the cattle, so they'd bring all these cattle down to take them over the ferry. There was the butcher shops in Maclean, May and Armstrong's it used to be, and they'd load all these ferry cattle on, and then one or two would get away, and they'd swim the river.
And the fishermen used to come up the river of a night time in the motorboats and the net punts. You could hear them, but you couldn't see where they were. They didn't have lights or anything on, and it was just Russian roulette, whether you run over them or not.
Probably couldn't see because there was no street lights, no lights on the bank, nothing those days. When the coming in get close, some of the cars had put their lights on to see where the bank was. They didn't have them on to hit the bank while you're up the bank. Moonlight night was all right, but dark night.
Well, in 1965, when they put the first lot of street lights there at the ferry approach, it was a pleasure because you could see where the bank was. Yes, it used to run 24 hours when I was on it, other than the 1.5 hours for the meals. And you had one bloke there and you were coming up to your meal hour, and instead of leaving him sit there for half an hour, you used to put him on there and put a rock behind the wheel and head across the other side with the gates wide open at the back end and hoping across the engineer didn't come along to catch you.
They do better today though.
2 per shift, and they do 12-hour shifts. I used to have the trawlers get tangled up in the ropes. Their transport of getting the cane to the mill after it was harvested used to have to go by river in the barges. And when they come around the bend there on the island side, you didn't know they were coming. And if he come around the corner and you were out in the middle of the river, he had 16 punts on, and you used to get in his road, and you used to be wrapped around with cane barges and everything. So you used to have to watch out for him. Well, the school bus used to be another one. The buses used to come on there, and half the time they never had brakes or anything like that. You didn't know whether they were going to stop.
In flood time, they used to take the ferry off and they'd tie it to a big fig tree on the bank. The big fig tree is not there anymore, so they put 2 big posts in. They tie it to that now. Sometimes it used to break the rope, or in flood time and that, it used to pull one of the ropes out, the posts out on the other side. Well, we learnt to swim, we learnt to row, we learnt everything while we were on the ferry.